Loyalty isn't the promise you thought it was. You gave every ounce, every late night spent swallowing your doubts, every silent sacrifice carried like armor, and still you weren't the man she wanted. That's the brutal truth. Your loyalty became the shadow you fought against, not the fortress you imagined. You weren't rewarded for standing your ground. You were left alone, a lone wolf howling into the dark that swallowed your devotion. That fire you carried inside, the one you stoked with discipline and resolve, it didn't light her path. Instead, it flickered out in silence. You believed loyalty would carve the map, draw the stars in line so you'd be chosen. But no, loyalty is not a guarantee. It's not a coin to be cashed or a leash to bind someone else. It's heavy steel you hold for yourself. It's the quiet pillar beneath your bones, the solid earth beneath the storm, not the chain around your neck. You learned this walking through the coldest nights when no one looked your way, when your faith in loyalty was met with absence. Remember this: what you gave was never the problem. What you gave was pure. It just wasn't meant for that door. And it's time you stop knocking where there's no welcome. Loyalty is not your burden, it's your strength. Stand with it, not behind it. You've been told to open up, lay your soul bare like some kind of offering on the altar of modern connection. To be patient, to listen, to express. Like those are weapons you wield in a world thirsty for authenticity. But what comes after you bleed your truth? Scorn, indifference, a chilling silence where your loyalty should have been honored. You gave yourself over, piece by piece, and instead of being seen, you vanished like smoke into a room full of dismissive eyes. Why does your loyalty, the very thing that ties you to others, make you invisible? Why is the man who stands steady, who stays true, no one's first thought and everyone's footnote? Has it ever felt like you're throwing your spirit against a wall only to watch it shatter, dry and hollow? No echo, no answer, no acknowledgement? You're trained to be emotionally present but not honored for it, to soften where bluntness might have saved you. You've been sharpened to feel deeply, but only carved to disappear under the weight of unreturned respect. There's a brutal distance in this, like walking through a storm with no shelter, your honesty soaked and torn by indifferent winds. The world tells you vulnerability is strength, but forgets to mention it's also a kind of surrender when your truth falls on ears grown deaf. Your persistence in showing up, your unwavering constancy, your honor wrapped around your shoulders like a battle standard. None of it guarantees a place in the war council. You become the quiet soldier, marked by scars no one asks about, the man whose patience is mistaken for weakness and whose silence is read as absence. Loyalty should root you, yet it often leaves you exposed, a lone wolf howling under stars that don't witness his pain. This is no small heartbreak. It's a war for your presence itself. You've fought it in secret, in the spaces where your voice cracked open and no one leaned in. But the truth you need to hear is this: your worth is not measured by the noise you make or the thanks you get. Sometimes the hardest fight is holding your ground in silence, where others have stepped away. You haven't just been overlooked. You've been trained not to expect recognition. Yet here you are, still standing. You walked through hell by asking for nothing but respect, and that in itself is a kind of rebellion. The world may not see you, but you know the weight you carry. Loyalty isn't invisibility, it's iron beneath the skin, a fire no one else can put out. Pain has a name, but it isn't the shout of a crowd or the weight of their scorn. It's the quiet pull inside you, the part that waits for someone to see you, to nod in approval, to hand you the validation you think will settle the storm. The Stoics didn't chase approval. They stared down tempests with the steady stance of a storm-tested oak, roots deep in earth no wind could erode. Imagine a man you know. Maybe it's someone you've seen burn out like a candle in pursuit of people who never paid the bill for his loyalty. One day, he stops the endless chasing, stops offering pieces of himself to those who never asked for the whole. He becomes like that oak, solid, grounded, and unmoved. The kind of man who stands because he knows that the winds howl, the shifting branches of popularity or rejection don't decide his strength. He faces storms not by bending like a reed, but by holding fast, embracing what he cannot change and mastering what he can, the silence inside, the space of pure, self-contained power. This is what the Stoics taught. Your worth isn't tied to the fickle nods of strangers or the fleeting approval of the crowd. It's forged in the fire of your own refusal to be controlled by anything outside your own reasoned command. When you grasp this, you stop being the man desperate to be seen and start becoming the man who chooses his own ground. The pains that once felt like wildfire, scorching your confidence, become nothing more than smoldering ashes beneath the feet of a warrior who's traded desperation for stillness. That fire doesn't consume you anymore. It tempers you like steel hammered in a forge, sharper, harder, ready for any battle without shouting a single plea. You become the resolute oak standing through the storm, untouched by winds of validation, because your roots drink deeply from a well others can't see or reach.
No more bargaining with pain. No more negotiating for approval. This is not a surrender to cold indifference, but a warrior's acceptance, a stoic's freedom planted deep inside, unshaken by external noise. The worth of a man is not in the eyes that judge him, but in the foundation he builds beneath himself. Remember that when the world forgets your name, when respect is withheld like water in a drought, you are not the reflection in their eyes. You are the oak rooted in your own soil. The battle is quiet now, but it is no less fierce. You walked through fire, and now you stand, not seeking the light, but being the solid darkness others lean on. This is where men become men, still, unmoved, unbroken. You have to abandon the expectation that others will meet you where you stand. Detachment isn't about shutting down care. It's about cutting loose the chains tied to their approval. Your worth isn't a tally kept by their hands. It's the compass you carry deep inside, carved by your own steady growth and relentless calm. When you let go of the demand for reciprocation, you reclaim the helm of your own fate, steering through the waves that others thought would drown you. This is the cold iron truth. The world will reflect back what it wants, not what you deserve. So why carry the weight of their judgment like armor? Let it fall away and watch your shoulders widen under a lighter sky. Emotional control isn't about burying your fire. It's about channeling the blaze so it burns the right path, not the bridge behind you. In moments when rejection claws at your ribs, when disrespect whispers poison in your ear, hold your heart anchored like the hull of a ship in a storm. The winds may howl, but your spirit doesn't have to shatter. Feel the storm rush through without letting it dismantle your fortress. This isn't weakness or numbness. It's the craftsmanship of a man who knows the difference between the storm and the shore. You don't extinguish the heat, you shape it. Forge it into the unbreakable steel of confidence that no fist of circumstance can bend. Your mission is the flame that burns brighter than any distraction or false hope. It's the reason you wake up before dawn, the quiet drum beneath the chaos of everyday noise. Whatever your path, work, craft, sweat on the floor, or books burned by your mind, make it yours alone. When you walk with a mission defined by your own hand, all sideways looks, all the petty distractions become faint echoes against the roar of your commitment. You don't chase approval, you chase purpose, and that hunger silences the crowd that once tried to drag you down. The wolf runs not after the herd's direction, but by the instinct of the hunt. Solitude isn't a void. It's your most trusted ally in a world built for noise. Sitting with yourself, away from demands, allows the layers of expectation to peel back. Silence sharpens you. It reveals the raw contours of who you actually are beneath the exhaustion, beneath the bruises. This is where clarity lives, Here, the echoes of others' opinions dissolve into the distance, and you hear your own voice, steady and unshaken. You build your foundation here, stone by stone, not through chaos or crowd, but through the heavy silence that only a man who's been tested can endure. Leading yourself begins with this inner authority, a leadership carved not from volume or show, but from the quiet certainty of experience. You don't need to tell your story loud for it to be true. Your steps mark the path. Your actions, slow and deliberate, draw the line between who you were and who you're becoming. This is leadership forged in the forge of authenticity, tempered with patience, and carried by a man who walks through hell without raising his voice. When you lead from this place, the world listens, not because you shout, but because the weight of your presence can't be ignored. I don't explain. I elevate. The wreckage you thought would break you didn't. It forged you. You're not the man who crumbled under the weight of rejection or blurred into someone else's definition of worth. You're something else now, a sovereign force, quiet but unyielding. This isn't about proving yourself to anyone who looked away. It's about the hard-lined ownership of who you are when the noise fades and no one's watching. You've walked through storms that could have drowned you, yet here you stand, measured, unshaken, and deliberate. The world might still throw shadows, but you've lit your own fire deep enough to keep the cold at bay. Your value is no longer a coin tossed in others' hands. It's carved into the steel of your own spirit, forged with discipline, tempered by silence. This is the rebirth every man craves, but few will endure. Rising not with rage, but with a steady pulse that beats for no one but yourself. You carry resilience like armor. It's not loud, it doesn't demand attention, but it commands respect. The power you sought outside always lived inside, waiting for a moment when you'd stop begging and start standing. Remember this as you press forward. Your presence alone is a declaration. I hold my power in my silence. Let those words settle into your bones. They are the anthem of a man who knows the weight of loss, the sting of disrespect, and the exile from identity, and still keeps walking in purpose without apology. You don't explain what you are. You don't apologize for the battles you fought. You don't shout over the noise. You move with a quiet defiance that cuts deeper than any blade. This is your signature now. Steady, composed, unbreakable. I don't lead with words. I lead in silence.